And the fact that you can hum or sing or whistle his solos almost in their entirety, almost every time, that you could reliably do that they could stick in your memory like that, filled with hooks of their own that would just slot in to the overall arc of the song. But like I said, push it to an even more sublime place. That's what made his playing so special. Ace Frehley has just passed away at the age of 74. Frehley was, of course, the founding lead guitar player of the band Kiss in its heyday from 1973, when the band formed, until his official departure in 1982. It's a little murky when he actually leaves versus when it's officially announced, but he played on 9 Kiss studio albums during their classic period, the first 9, and appears on the cover of one more. That would be Creatures of the Night, which he did not play on. He also, of course, was on their classic first 2 live albums, Alive and Alive 2. And I wanted to reflect a little bit on his, like, what he meant, not just to me, but just more broadly. So it's funny because Kiss is a band, I actually do really love them, and got into them as an adolescent, like millions and millions of other American kids, and kids, in fact, all over the world. But I actually got into them a decade later. It was actually in 1984 when I would go to this video store around the corner from I guess I was in middle school at the time. They would have the Animalize Live Uncensored video playing, or I walked in there once and it was playing, and I started watching it. And I am old enough to remember commercials on TV for all their merchandise and stuff like that. But I was 6 going on 7 at the end of the 70s. So it wasn't until I was really discovering music on my own in the mid 80s. And I was like, oh, wow, I know there's a lot of history there. Let me go back and look into it. So I got the Animalize Live Uncensored video, which is not, Ace is not on that. He was out of the band by then. And then went back digging into their back catalog. And I gotta say, they're an easy band to take just on the surface level, right? As kind of flash over substance, for sure. I can see why people would get that impression. And I also can see why they would represent this sort of like absurd degree of crass commercialism, right? Of just like monetizing everything and being like a cartoon character version of a rock band. Also the way that the band's real like creative nucleus and leaders, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, talk about their music. It's like, okay, these guys sound really shallow, right? I have a different impression of them. I certainly see where people would feel that way. But for a time, they were a very, very, very high-octane rock band. I think their reputation, although it is self-inflicted for sure, as being flash over substance, is way unfair for the music they were making. I think they had a very, very special spark as like a certain gritty 70s style rock or guitar-oriented rock with a driving feel to it. Each member brought something unique, so they had a unique chemistry between the 4 original members, which really, when we think about Kiss, we think of 2 phases. We think of the 70s, and then we think of, 3. We think of the 70s, and we think of sort of the detours they were taking while Ace was still in the band, and then we think of this like 80s style hard rock / metal band that's almost a completely different animal than what they were in the 70s. But in hearing all these tributes to Ace and hearing people talk about, well, you know, he inspired so many people to pick up the guitar, they kind of overlook what his playing, like the actual value of his playing and how special it was and how distinctive it was. Yes, there were like, you can't even count the number of kids who were like, I love his makeup, so I'm going to dress like him for Halloween. I actually did that as a teenager. But I would argue that with Kiss and with Ace in particular, if it didn't have this spark to it, if there wasn't something actually there, they wouldn't have resonated as much. If it was just a gimmick, they wouldn't have lasted as long as they did. They wouldn't have held on to their status as one of the world's preeminent and most visible bands. Now, their career did have multiple peaks and valleys, but I have always said this, for a 2 to 3 year period from 75 through maybe the beginning of 78, they were an amazing rock band. Up until they started declining and started going in more of a disco direction, which I actually like those two records, and I like music from The Elder as well, which is Ace's last album with them. I sort of enjoy their peaks and valleys up to a certain point, then I get off the bus with them completely. And I've always said, even if they didn't have all that stuff, the face makeup, the pyrotechnics, if they didn't have the visual aspect to wow you with and the big giant show, which was like this huge Roman spectacle almost, right? Even without all that, they would have completely kicked ass. There was something about their fire and their audacity and their like going for it vibe that I think was really only topped one sort of half generation later by Van Halen. If you listen to their first two live albums, which are both heavily doctored, you get a sense of what they were like how powerful their show was in person, and you're just listening to it on the record. It's not, you're not seeing the show happen. And in spite of the fact that those albums are, like I said, heavily doctored, there's a bootleg, and I can never remember whether it's from 77 or 78. It's from Houston. I have a VHS tape of it, and it has none of the like overdubbing or none of the polish. And I watched that bootleg and I'm like, wow, they actually really did kick ass. Now it's much more raw. Like I said, it lacks some of the polish, but the playing, the way they brought it was undisputable. And then they started to go into like a dip phase, and Ace quits at the end of that first decline, but he was an integral part and then some of what their whole sound was. Eddie Kramer, who they worked with, the producer / engineer, who they worked with famously on Alive and then a couple of their records and then Alive too. So he did Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun from their peak period. He basically said, in his view, this was the engine of the Ace, was the engine of the band. I wanted to do a list of like my favorite Ace solos and leads, but unless you know the songs, it's not really very engaging for me to just talk about them without being able to play them, and I don't want to risk a copyright strike, even if you really know the songs very, very well. So I would recommend 2 videos that really break down Ace's style with a guitar player actually playing along to the music and explaining the techniques and the solos. The first one is on the channel The Art of Guitar, and there's a video where The Art of Guitar breaks down 17 of Ace's techniques. That's an excellent video. And then there's Nacho de dos Largos. That's the name of the channel. I'll link to it in the description. That's guitarist Ignacio Torres' channel, and he does a video where he plays several of Ace's solos, and you can see how they're played, and he does a really great job. It's a very like fiery performance of those solos. So you're better off going there. I will say that without Ace, you don't have Kiss as we know them. It's just undeniable. I mean, you can't... This band ended up being sort of, the proverbial more than the sum of their parts, but Ace was one of the most important parts of their entire sort of working structure. And it's hard to get a sense of some of like exactly what the guitar interplay between him and Paul Stanley was, because Paul Stanley played a lot of rhythm guitar, because they started fairly early on not having everybody play on all the songs. In fact, from what I understand, Ace was the first one to start fucking up, basically, and by their 4th studio album, Destroyer, producer Bob Ezrin replaced Ace's solo on the song Sweet Pain, and then there's another one, I think it's Flaming Youth, maybe as well. No, maybe not Flaming Youth. I should know this, but I know on Sweet Pain, Ace did not play the solo. Dick Wagner, famously of Alice Cooper's band, played the solo on that song. However, Ace does some leads on there that is trademark Ace. He really had a knack for writing or playing solos that felt like a part of the song, that would lift the song up, which is why I love his solos. There was a real artistic flair to them. He would do a lot of noodling sort of in the second part of a solo, but the way he would come in to a solo, it would always have musical value and really add a more sort of sublime element to like where your adrenaline already was, like groove into a tune, like, yeah, I'm really loving this tune. And then he would come in and be like, okay, I'm going to take this one step even higher. And that is really behind what his appeal was. So a prime example, his solo at the end of the song Shock Me, which is the first song he ever sang with Kiss. He wrote it and sang it. His solo, so towards the end of it, it goes, it resolves. So after this like flurry of notes, it just comes back down to earth so beautifully. If you know the song, you know what I'm talking about. And then on the studio version, there's this like phaser at the very end of it that adds this really nice touch. And the fact that you can hum or sing or whistle his solos almost in their entirety, almost every time, that you could reliably do that they could stick in your memory like that, filled with hooks of their own that would just slot in to the overall arc of the song. But like I said, push it to an even more sublime place. That's what made his playing so special. I mean, how many other lead guitarists can you even say that about? When I think about like my top 5 soloists, I can't walk down the street humming or singing one of their solos. I just can't. So this really, that quality of his approach really set him apart and put him in a class, at least as far as I'm concerned, totally by himself. So I will share with you 2 of my favorite Ace stories. When it comes to Ace, I love his approach to soloing so much. I always like to joke, I even love him for the solos he didn't play on, and there were several. He didn't play the solos on anything on the 4th side of Alive 2, which is the studio songs. I actually love those songs, except for the one song he wrote, which is Rocket Ride. So he didn't play on anything else. So anyway, Bob Kulick tells a story about how he was in the studio playing in Ace's style. I'll link to that video as well where he's explaining the techniques because it's really fascinating, and it gave me so much more respect for Ace's playing and appreciation when I heard Kulick, who's a much more schooled, formally trained, refined, but also very intuitive musician, or I should say was, the late Bob Kulick. But when he was breaking down his mentality in coming up with these solos, intentionally trying to sound or play in Ace's style, it was like, wow, okay. I can really see through his eyes. I saw even more there than I had originally seen, which was a lot to begin with. But anyway, he tells a story. He's tracking a solo in the studio, and he walks out into the lounge area outside of the where he's recording, and he sees Ace sitting there, and Ace says, "So how'd I do?" And he's expecting it to be awkward, and that's just kind of sums up Ace's whole goofy persona. And then along similar lines, Ace talked about in his book how his code name for cocaine, when he was like talking to roadies or drug dealers or other rocker dudes or people in the entourage who were doing lines, after the show, his code for cocaine was Betty White, the actress Betty White. And they would be on the phone, be like, "Oh, when's Betty White expecting to get here? Oh, when are we expecting Betty White?" Which I detest cocaine. I think it's yucky and gross and skeevy and disgusting, and I never would want to even be around it. I've only ever seen cocaine twice in my life because it just gives me the icks. But I love that story. And like I said, you can point to Kiss as being a very, very superficial band. I know, however, even though I was drawn initially by their image, I know that as a teenager when I got into them, that part of their history was way in the rear view, and I was listening to the records. Yes, there was a visual component to those records, but I was being really galvanized by the music itself. And that's a big problem that Simmons and Stanley talk about the band and talk about their motivations in ways that are just so kind of obnoxious, especially Simmons, because, and this may sound completely insane to anybody who doesn't appreciate this band. But I think Simmons, I put him second to Paul McCartney in terms of the inventiveness, the imagination, the flair of his bass playing. Simmons may talk like somebody who just sees dollar signs everywhere. And he even, don't quote me on this, but I think has even referred to himself as not a musician, but I'm an entertainer, that kind of whole fucking trip. He's absolutely a musician, and a pretty deep one. I know, again, it sounds crazy. If you take this band at face value, that sounds nuts. It sounds like, what are you talking about? But listen to his bass lines. For years, I thought that can't actually be him. They must have brought somebody in to play his bass lines, and they've just never admitted it. And then watching the live footage, I know the guy comes across as completely image-oriented, but he's the real deal. And I've heard talk online about, there's that video of Gene Simmons with the super prolific bassist Carol Kay, and it's like, oh my God, this video shows what a shitty bass player he is because he's so struggling while she's explaining what it is to play behind the beat or something along those lines. No. It's not the case at all. Any two musicians who are like explaining ideas, you can see this happen in any band where there's like one person explaining an idea to somebody else and the other person's kind of just fumbling along until they get it and like, oh, okay, wait, are you saying over? Oh, no, right here. Okay, oh, right here. That's what it's like. Don't let that video fool you. The guy was at least a really, 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 really great bass player. He will not even attest to that himself. He'll say other hugely narcissistic things about himself, but somehow give his playing short shrift. Watch the Houston 78 or whatever video bootleg of them, and also listen to certain songs. I know this is a video on Ace, but listen to songs like Love Her All I Can, Ladies Room. I mean, on and on and on and on, and watch the way his lines walk up and down that fretboard. He's not quite to the level that Paul McCartney was. He's not quite as fluid, but he's pretty fucking close, at least in my book. Without his bass lines, this band would not have been 1/100th as interesting as they actually, I would argue, they were. And Frehley was also a huge part of that whole recipe. I would say that Simmons and Frehley were actually the musical anchors of the group, and Frehley had a more sort of conventionally blues pentatonic scale based style that was very much more anchored in rock, whereas Gene Simmons would play these walking bass lines that didn't seem to be weren't coming from the mind of somebody who's just confined by viewing everything from a rock lens, but they worked very, very, very well in this rock/hard rock frame. But Frehley in particular had a ton of personality in his style. And there's so many little signature things that he did on the guitar. Like, he definitely had his own language that really gave the music a certain stamp and a certain edge. He was by no means the most refined player. At times he could be even kind of crude, even compared to like people like, I don't know, like Joe Walsh and Ted Nugent. He wasn't the cleanest player. He was actually fairly sloppy. But when I hear people say, oh man, really famous guitar players, Scott Ian, Dimebag Darrell, I'm trying to think of who else, Kim Thayil from Soundgarden. I mean, so many people picked up the guitar because of this guy, but I find that they kind of emphasize the image part more than they should the musical part. I feel like Ace was kind of an underachiever in his career, but nevertheless, in Kiss, left a huge, massive imprint, and that's not just because he had cool makeup on his face. Ace was sort of like the George Harrison of Kiss, or the equivalent. It doesn't quite, like, it's not the best analogy, but certainly he didn't write as much as Simmons and Stanley did. And so his emergence as a creative force in the band happens later as you get towards, definitely towards the latter stage of his original tenure in the band. I don't even count the reunion post 96, but he wasn't super prolific. He definitely did start, like, so on the album Unmasked, there's 4 songs, I think, or I can't remember if it's, on Unmasked and Dynasty, there's more songs that he sings and or writes, which is very, very cool. But he kind of did his own thing. He wasn't at that point super integrated into the workings of the band. Otherwise, his playing is all over those two records, and it actually is all over The Elder as well, even though it was reduced by Bob Ezrin, and Ace complained about that. But you definitely hear his solos and throughout the album. He's not a completely diminished presence. And it's interesting too, because he is best known, I guess his biggest hit, Ace's, was a song he didn't write. It's from the Kiss solo album called New York Groove, and it was written by Russ Ballard and performed by the band Hello. But Ace's version is much more famous, at least here in the States, much more well known. I even see it like on sports broadcasts, live sports, like baseball or football. It'll occasionally come on, which is really cool. And I imagine it will come on over the next few days. As we're in the baseball playoffs, some producer at one of these networks is going to throw that in, like they did with Neil Peart or with Rush with Tom Sawyer the week that Neil Peart died. So that's my take. R.I.P. Ace Frehley. And to those who don't get it or don't appreciate him, maybe it will spark for you. Maybe you'll finally see what they've been going on and about for all these decades. So there you have it. That's my take. For FeedbackDef, I am Saby Reyes-Kulkarni, the apostate music journalist. If you like what I'm laying down, please do hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons so you never miss a post.
Hey! Guitarists! Lift it, salon!